Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book that I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, at the Bible Baptist bookstore, or follow me here. And if you would, subscribe to my channel. We're talking about the era where the rise of fascism before World War II, and my study will continue through the end of World War II before we go into special topics. So let's begin. Uh, America's economy and foreign policy is what I'm going to discuss today. Now, America, while ostensibly an enemy to anti-Christian and anti-capitalist communism, had a history of extending great amounts of aid to support the Soviet government. This became a great bone of contention during the 1960s as President Johnson sent aid to the Soviet Union while we fought them by proxy in Vietnam. It's always been as if there was more behind the scenes in our relationship with communism than what was on the surface. Herbert Hoover, future president, as head of the American Relief Administration, not only sent food aid to starving post-war Belgium, but also to the starving Soviet Union in 1921 to 23. The Great Worldwide Depression officially started on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, although many countries saw their economies slide the previous year. The economies of countries ground to a halt, and things like construction, which practically stopped, and farm prices collapsing, destroyed incomes and created food shortages. In the USA, an abundance of cheap credit and the growing indebtedness of business and consumer, farmer and city dweller, hit the proverbial wall when a typical business downturn forced them to stop buying the cheap goods that cheap credit afforded, which resulted in layoffs and further reductions in spending and a shrinkage of the economy. This is an oversimplification and certainly would make an interesting study. The many economic theories about the Depression blame either the government or the free market for failing. Some even claim that the Great Depression was manipulated by corporate interests who would have a benefit from the formation of fascist and socialist-like governments that resulted in Europe and the Americas as a result. In any event, 25% unemployment, runs on banks for massive withdrawals of funds, defaults on loans, and bank failures were epidemic. By 1933, American depositors had lost $140 billion in failed banks, and by the end of the 1930s, 9,000 American banks had failed, and the world was in economic chaos. This chaotic economic state turned the tide for the growing fascist governments. The Depression didn't end until massive rearming for war created a new prosperity. One theory is that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930 depressed farm exports, which caused banks heavily supporting that economic sector to fail, creating a ripple effect throughout the banking industry. Some sources say the Great Depression was probably caused by incompetent money policy on the part of the newly formed Federal Reserve banking system, which controls America's money supply. Panic and widespread runs on banks could have possibly been slowed by emergency lending rather than letting the money supply shrink. Another argument is the opposite notion that during the 20s, the Fed increased the money supply so much that the resulting unsustainable credit boom was bound to burst. In fact, the Great Depression was predicted in February of 1929 by economists Ludwig von Mises and August von Hayek. The president during the first years of the Depression was Herbert Hoover. Presidents are often blamed for the economic condition of the country at the time of an election, and Mr. Hoover lost in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York and former assistant secretary of the Navy. The next several decades of human history were deeply affected by this American president's foreign policy decisions. From almost as soon as FDR took office, the American public was mentally prepared through intense and ongoing propaganda, conditioned for war, in spite of the fact that they were sick of war and wanted little to do with foreign military involvement, particularly for another war in Europe. Taking from the work of historians including Carroll Quigley, various writers in Harry Elmer Barnes' Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, and Charles Callan Townsend, among others, the buildup to World War II appears to me to take place along the following lines. The main objective of American foreign policy from 1900 had seemed to be the preservation of the British Empire, according to Tansel in his book, Backdoor to War, Roosevelt Foreign Policy 1933 to 1941. Strong and deep ties existed between both governments when Britain began to view America as a potential ally in coming wars. Carroll Quigley, in his classic Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment, outlines the close working relationship between Britain and America throughout the 20th century. In fact, some economic theories on the cause of the Great Depression have to do with America helping out Britain's struggling economy after World War I, which is too complicated a topic to discuss here. If you're interested in economics, I'd recommend books found at mises.org, Mises.org, MISES, Mises.org. And in the event, Anglo-American cooperation in an attempt to dominate the world began in 1899, and during President Theodore Roosevelt's administration, a warning was sounded to anyone who thought of trying to take advantage of Britain's troubles during the latter part of the Boer War. In the Far East, the Anglo-American alliance was definitely pro-Japanese, as Japan tried to wrest control of North China from its enemy, Imperial Russia. Even the American press was pro-Japanese when Japan launched its surprise attack on Russia at Port Arthur in 1904. The New York Times praised the heroism and resourcefulness of the Japanese Navy, and the St. Louis Dispatch applauded the action as well. The Cleveland Plain Dealer likened the Japanese action to Sir Francis Drake's action at Cadiz that embarrassed the King of Spain. They sure would change their tune when it was American sailors being killed 37 years later. Japan gained substantial advantages by way of the terms of the treaty, which President Theodore Roosevelt sponsored, making Japan the dominant power in the Far East. Although President Roosevelt's goal was to keep the powers in the area in balance by being at odds with each other, just short of war, the fact was that in 1907, Japan and Russia agreed to cooperation in limiting their spheres of influence in Mongolia and Manchuria. Britain had wanted just such a partnership, as in looking for future allies in the war she knew was coming with Germany. The empire had hoped to be able to buy an ally with parts of China it controlled as payment. As Russia and Japan became more dominant on northern China, the colonial control of the European powers in America over China, called the open door, was in trouble. President Roosevelt himself was not sold on the status quo in China and was more than willing to sign the Root-Takahira Agreement in 1908, which granted Japan a free hand in Manchuria in return for refraining from aggressive moves toward the American colony of the Philippines. At this time, America, a new colonial power, having acquired its overseas empires less than a decade earlier at the expense of Spain, was pro-Japanese and pro-British in its inclinations. In 1910, Roosevelt wrote to the then President Taft that we should take no step that would make Japan feel insecure in North China. It was clear that Mr. Roosevelt viewed Japan as having as clear an interest in Asia as the USA did in South America. He felt we had no real pressing interest in Manchuria anyway, and certainly nothing to go to war over. The wisdom of Theodore Roosevelt was lost on those who followed him in office. President Taft believed firmly in what is called dollar diplomacy in the Far East and decided to support big business in placing large investments in China as the underpinning of American foreign policy. A further plan was created by which the railways in Manchuria would be placed under international control, with America being one of the controllers. As this was at odds with what the British Foreign Office would have liked, the plan was rejected by them. The British government spent a great deal of time offering other commercial deals with the US government. If the German Foreign Office had been as astute as the British, there would have been no American entry into World War I. Not only was political accord with America achieved, in spite of the fact that we had fought 2 wars against Britain and very nearly fought a third one over their meddling in the American Civil War and their very near acknowledging the government of the Confederacy as legitimate one, as well as having numerous disputes over fishing. But a great deal of business was done with British firms. After 1914, British propaganda was able to convince the Americans of my grandfather's generation that their war was our war. Even so, excuse me, in a type of repeat of events before the War of 1812, Britain seized numerous American ships under the flimsiest of pretexts. Our Anglophile president at that time, Mr. Wilson, was even pushed to demand some kind of naval action to protect our property. Still, nothing was done against Great Britain. On February 4th, 1915, Germany placed a war zone around the British Isles. After February 18, any merchant ship found in that zone would be sunk. On February 10th, the U.S. threatened Germany with dire consequences if any American ship was sunk. In any event, we have already discussed the results of these actions. However, If America had not entered World War I, it would probably have ended in a stalemate, and the historians of the era insist that there would have been no World War II. The Versailles Treaty of 1919 was badly handled, and the old balance of power in Europe was destroyed. World War II resulted because of the failures in diplomacy after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles was the cornerstone of the, quote, peace that existed between the world wars. Poland was given the German city of Danzig so that it would have access to the Baltic Sea. Germany deeply resented the interference of the German-speaking people who had suffered under Polish misadministration. In the Far East, things changed drastically after FDR took office. He chose a policy of opposition to the Japanese position of supremacy in Asia. He chose to support China, a nation in conflict under the control of various warlords. A weak government under Chiang Kai-shek and a powerful communist revolution led by Mao Zedong. These two parties have been the heirs of the revolution started by Sun Yat-sen. The Kuomintang under Chiang split from the communists in 1927. In the struggle against Japanese domination, however, the Kuomintang and the communists cooperated with a great deal of aid from Soviet Russia. Japan tried to appeal to FDR by declaring it was the only bulwark of Anglo-American capitalism in the region and that it was a barrier against Soviet Russia. FDR was not interested in Japanese pleas of friendship and pro-capitalist ideals and chose to support China, embroiled in what seemed like a never-ending civil war and only united against Japan. There is no question that Japan was a ruthless, brutal fighting machine which engaged in atrocities that we find in retrospect unforgivable. That being said, there may have been no Cold War, no Korea, no Vietnam, and no jihad against America had FDR decided to support Japan and to even cooperate with the Japanese domination in northern China in particular. So we're going to talk about Japan and Germany next, and I hope that you will study world history. Disagree with me if you must. I did oversimplify the Federal Reserve's role and what they do in the money supply. I made it very, very simple. So you can argue about that. If you're an economic expert, you'll say, no, that you're misinterpreting this, that. But it's clear that our foreign policy being probably the most powerful country in the world as far as industrial, potentially most powerful, not the most powerful at the time, but potentially the most powerful. Our foreign policy helped initiate, made possible World War II. Just like modern day Russia would have no foothold in Syria were it not for Obama's failed foreign policy. So I'll leave it to you to study, come to your own conclusions. Disagree with me, that's okay. If you get angry and you say, no, you're wrong, you said this and it's wrong, as long as you have an opinion about world history, I'm happy. Thank you.